Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. We are thrilled to be launching today's report. As many of you know, I work at the United Nations Foundation. My name is Seema Jalan. I'm the Senior Director in our Women and Girls program. And the UN Foundation was created in 1998 by a generous gift from Ted Turner, who provided the gift to really support the causes of the United Nations globally and to address the world's global challenges. In particular, universal access to reproductive health. The Universal Access Project, which our project is coined, is a large-scale, multi-stakeholder advocacy effort that seeks to strengthen the US's leadership in achieving universal access to family planning and reproductive health. A goal set 20 years ago this year at the International Conference on Population and Development, and reinvigorated by Millennium Development Goal 5B. With our partners, many of whom are in the room today, thank you for joining us. UAP works to galvanize US leadership by increasing political will with strategic constituencies and policymakers to support global access to voluntary family planning as a central and integrated component of US foreign assistance as well as US policy. I want to start by thanking our partners today, in particular the World Faith Development Dialogue and Katherine Marshall's team, our partners of the Universal Access Project, the UN Foundation team, and in particular Shalini Edens, who led our work over the last 6 months in organizing today's event, and the Pew Conference Center for hosting today. And all of our speakers, many of whom have traveled to attend today. This event wouldn't be possible without all of you. Thank you. A few housekeeping notes. We are live tweeting at #FaithFP, so I hope you'll join the conversation, and we have wireless in the room. And hard copies of the report are right on the table outside, as well as a 2-page policy brief. There will be an electronic version available today on the World Faith Development Dialogue website. And we're also videotaping, if you hadn't noticed behind you, which will be available on the World Faith Development website in a few weeks. Again, we're thrilled to have you all here today to launch this incredibly important report, aimed at dispelling the myth that faith-based organizations are incompatible with the provision of family planning services globally. What we have heard over and over from our partners in the field is that not only are faith-based organizations not shying away from providing family planning, but that in many regions, faith groups fill a critical gap in reaching the world's most vulnerable women. We felt this was a truth on the ground that was not making its way to the decision makers in Washington, D.C. So we reached out to Katherine and her team at Georgetown to see if they would be interested in writing a report that would bring these important stories from around the world to Washington. Fortunately, they said yes, and thanks to Katherine and her team at Georgetown, we have a groundbreaking report to share with you today. We have an excellent panel lined up to walk us through the key findings. We're really hopeful that today's launch will spark a greater conversation in the community about the essential role of all types of organizations in providing family planning services, and in particular, the critical role of faith-based organizations, especially where they are needed most. And now I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator, Reverend Gary Hall, who is the 10th Dean of the Washington National Cathedral. Prior to coming to Washington, Reverend Hall served as Dean and President of Seabury Western Theological Seminary in Illinois, and has served in senior positions in churches all the way from Pennsylvania to California. A native of California, Reverend Dean has also taught at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale and at the Episcopal Theological School at Claremont, UCLA. He holds degrees from UC Berkeley, UCLA, as well as the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Reverend Dean.
Thank you. I need to turn on my mic. Thanks so much. Before I move on, I just want to say a little bit about why someone from Washington National Cathedral is a part of this conversation. I think many people know the cathedral as a place that hosts major events in American public life. But the cathedral also has a 100-year history and mission of being at the intersection of faith and public policy. Over and over again, both in international affairs and in domestic affairs, the cathedral has sponsored symposia, it has sponsored conferences, it has actually done groundbreaking work both in Middle East and in domestic issues around where faith and public policy come together. And when Katherine Marshall asked me to be part of this, I immediately said yes, because there seems to me to be nothing more important in the international arena than how faith communities can live into their mission in helping the developing world take hold of family planning and be engaged in that as a response to whatever faith we're from. So I'm happy to be here this morning just on my own, and I'm really happy to be here representing the National Cathedral in our ongoing effort to be conveners of conversations about where faith and public policy intersect. What I'm going to do for the next bit is essentially just keep the conversation going and tell you a little bit about our panelists as they speak. And the schedule is that we're going to ask the panelists to speak one at a time for, say, 3 to 5 minutes. And then after that, we will have some audience questions and answers. So first up, to my immediate left, is Katherine Marshall. The reason I am here, Katherine Marshall is the executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue. She's a senior fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, visiting professor in the School of Foreign Service. She's worked for 4 decades in international development, focusing on the world's poorest countries. And she spent 35 years at the World Bank in many assignments focused on Africa, Latin America, and East Asia. From 2000 to 2006, she was counselor to the bank's president on ethics, values, and faith in development. And she holds numerous board positions, one of which is on the board of the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral Foundation, which is how she and I have come to know each other. She's the author of several books and many articles, most recently Global Institutions of Religion, Ancient Movers, Modern Shakers, published by Routledge in 2013. Katherine, welcome.
Well, good morning. We're absolutely delighted to be here today. We've been waiting for this day for 6 months. And I think what I wanted to do was primarily to provide some context of what this report is and why we did it. First, one of the words that's used most in the international development world is partnership. And it's a sensitive word because it's never quite clear what exactly it means. So it's been very rewarding for us to build a partnership with the United Nations Foundation and with other organizations through our work on this report. So we are hoping to give meaning to partnership, which means not a financial relationship, but a true engagement and a mutual learning. And I think that's our hope, that we will open up or encourage or nudge forward that aspect of our work. So why this report? The organization, the World Faiths Development Dialogue, has an interesting history and an unusual mission. It came out of an agreement between Jim Wolfenson when he was president of the World Bank and George Carey when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, with the Aga Khan, with Etchegaray from the Vatican, with Prince Talal of Jordan, and several other world faith leaders, that it was nonsense, but even more a tragedy, that the world's religious communities were at odds with the world's development communities, because these were the institutions that cared about poverty and cared about the poor, and they should be working together, not working against each other. This was pre-9/11, as the sort of anti-debt movement was building up. So they agreed that some kind of an engagement and dialogue was necessary, and I was drafted to work on that. And that's another story, a long story, but have been working on it really for the past 14 years. One of the areas that we've focused on in the World Faiths Development Dialogue and also at Georgetown is trying to fill both knowledge and perception gaps. I was part of the earlier generation where we tried to put gender issues on the agenda. And one thing we learned was that until we had evidence, until we could demonstrate that bringing women into the development processes through education, through employment, through respect, until we could show evidence, we could not get people to pay attention. And we are convinced that very much the same is true on issues around religion. People tend to react to religion emotionally in terms of what they believe rather than the evidence. But as we've gone around the world talking to people, doing interviews, et cetera, there are two issues that have come up all the time. The first is the sense that religious institutions do not support equality of women. So the issue of gender and women comes up all the time. And the second is that the issues of health, family health, individual health, are enormously important. And yet, just to give you an idea on health, the estimates of the share of global health, or health in Africa, it's fuzzy, that religious institutions provide range from 7 to 70%, which gives you a clear idea that there are enormous gaps in knowledge and in definition. So those two issues are ones that we have focused on enormously. And so when the United Nations Foundation suggested that we work together, and Ray Martin was also part of this, on trying to bring some evidence to the debates around religious roles and attitudes on family planning, it fit very clearly with this broad framework. So we set about with relatively limited resources. This was primarily done through interviews and through desk research and through building on our own experience and knowledge. We tried to put together a set of stories and case studies about religious institutions. And there were, I think, 3 findings that we came to. The first, which was not a surprise, but which was interesting, was the enormous diversity of experience, which the way the Aga Khan network, the way the Methodists, the way the Catholic Church, et cetera, approach family planning is rather different, and the language they use is different. But there's a common core, and a common conviction that healthy families depend on the respect that is involved in parents making a choice and having the knowledge to carry out their wishes. The second was that it was actually quite difficult to find some of the information because, in contrast to some of the passionate advocates globally for family planning, many of the family planning programs are an integral part of a much broader set of health interventions, sometimes not advertised, sometimes not visible. So I had a couple of opportunities to talk about family planning with religious institutions in the course of this report in Kenya and in Indonesia. And in both cases, we had to dig to find out exactly what was happening. And in Cambodia, where we've been working for many years, even when we looked for evidence on maternal health and maternal mortality, we found it quite difficult to find the examples, not because they're not there, but because they're presented with different language and in different ways. So we had to dig. And then the third finding, which again didn't surprise us, but we found quite a lot of evidence, was that these programs tend to be concentrated on the most difficult places and the most difficult communities, where the peri-urban areas, the major slums. That's where you find, I did a blog for the Huffington Post, this sort of striking contrast between robust entrepreneurial programs that advertise in large letters, male circumcision or whatever it is, and then this array of faith-linked clinics, drug pharmacies, etc. And in the conflict zones, I would guarantee that in the Central African Republic now in South Sudan, it is these kinds of communities and these kinds of facilities that are still there, that are still providing a service. So that is the nature of this report. I would emphasize in closing that we are only scratching the tip of the iceberg. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of similar efforts. And one of their characteristics is that they are rarely documented. There's been an attitude that we're too busy helping the poor to write up what we do and to fill out forms. That attitude is changing, but still there is a tendency to hide. Reverend Hall preached yesterday on the bushel, or it was the light under the bushel. The light under the bushel. There's a tendency to hide under the bushels rather than to let the light. So our objective, in the broad interest of serving women, of serving poor communities, and of adding knowledge that will enrich the quality of development work. That's the spirit in which this report was done, and in which we hope you will read it and give us feedback and help us to take the work further.
Thank you so much, Catherine. To Catherine's left is Karen Sichinga. She is the Executive Director of Churches Health Association of Zambia, a network of 151 church, hospitals, and clinics delivering health services nationwide, particularly in the rural and hard-to-reach areas of Zambia. Karen's also the current chairperson of the Africa Christian Health Association's platform, a network of 21 Christian health associations in Africa. She's a graduate of the University of Alberta in Canada and the University of Leeds, and she holds a master's degree in international public health and has spent the last 22 years in the fields of public health and has contributed to a number of public health-related studies and publications. She's interested in project design and implementation, monitoring and evaluation, resource mobilization, and managing multiple large grants. Karen, it is wonderful to welcome you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I just wish to thank the World Faith Development Dialogue and Universal Access, and indeed Christian Connections for International Health for making it possible for me to be here. I'm wearing two hats. I'm wearing the hat of Charles, where I come from. I come from Zambia. Zambia is in the Southern Africa. We are 10 countries in Southern Africa, and this is where I'm coming from. I'm wearing the second hat as representing Africa churches or Christian health associations in Africa. And in there, we are 22 countries and a network, big networks in our own respective countries, and we work together to make sure that we provide access to treatment in our respective countries. I think a lot has been said. I think my first comment, I think I just want to appreciate the effort in putting this report together. I think she has ably articulated the fact that we do not have the time to document. And I think in Africa, it is two things. We are Christians, we are faith-based organization, and we are more concerned with making sure that we take the care to the people who need it than sit down and document. The second thing is the African background. We are not very, very good at beating our own drums, as we would say in Africa. Beating your own drums, the loudest. Selling yourself and saying this is what we do. We are not very good in Africa. So documentation is not something that we do best. And one of the things that we don't do documentation is because we lack also human resource. So For me, I'm very, very happy with the report in two ways. First, it has vindicated us. It has vindicated us as faith-based organizations. For the longest time, we are said not to be doing family planning. Whether you're Catholic or Protestant, how could we not be doing family planning? Because the faith-based organizations, the hospitals and the clinics, in most part of Africa, in most part of our region, sub-Saharan Africa, they were there even before the independence of most African countries. So the faith-based organization, hospitals and clinics, they were there before we got independent. If I may give a case of Zambia, we had more church hospitals, both Catholic and Protestants, at independence than the government hospitals. But of course, after 50 years of independence, the government has had more hospitals. So how could we not have been involved in family planning? Whether it's natural family planning, call it whatever it is that you want to call it, it is still family planning. And we understand family planning as allowing that woman to choose when to have their baby and to space, and also to allow her to recuperate from from her last baby, the trauma she went through. And most women, where I come from, want to do family planning. I have a very interesting story. I have a friend who the husband didn't allow for her to do family planning. And she told me that she was taking a pill and she would go outside and drink it. And each time the husband at 7 p.m. would say, "Where are you going?" No, I just want to make sure that everything that we left outside, and this is a village woman, is inside the house so that it's not taken by somebody else. When what she was actually doing is going to take her pill. And 2 years later, when she wasn't becoming pregnant, the husband became very suspicious. And why is it that you're not getting pregnant? She's like, "No, I don't know what is happening." And the mother-in-law also, there was a lot of pressure from the mother-in-law, who also wanted to see that she was getting pregnant for their second baby. And she's like, "I don't know what is happening." And so she confided in me that she used to take her pill in secret. So even women who haven't gone to school have actually gone and accessed the family planning programs wherever they are. I think the challenges we face in a lot of faith-based organizations is that for a case of Zambia, we work very closely with government. We work extremely closely with government so that even the family planning commodities go through the national medical stores and they are distributed to whether it's church hospitals or government hospitals. The only difference is the Catholic facilities. But what we have done in my organization is to make sure that we train the health personnel at the Catholic health facilities and the community distributors at community level, so that when people want to family planning and they go to a Catholic facility and they cannot be provided with, we make sure that we strengthen the referral systems. And we inform the women in the community where to go and get and access the family planning services. The other challenge is in Africa, usually the commodities, sometimes they are not enough. And so as faith-based organization, because most of us are depending to access commodities from the government, sometimes they are not enough to go around. So if government hasn't got enough, it also means that faith-based organization will not have enough to have them in their clinic, at least for the Protestant in my country, or the Protestant health facilities have family planning methods, all of them, except for the Catholics, of course, which promote the natural family planning methods. But it is still family planning.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. Now, our next guest is Dr. Azza Karam, and she is Senior Culture Advisor coordinates the fund-wide global activities on culture and religion at the United Nations Population Fund. Prior to joining UNFPA, she was the Senior Policy Research Advisor at the United Nations Development Program in the Regional Bureau for Arab Studies, where she worked on Arab Human Development Reports, among other portfolios. Dr. Karam has also worked at the World Conference of Religions for Peace, where she founded the first Global Women of Faith Network, and she advised on issues related to Muslim and Arab affairs. Her programmatic experience spans the fields of global multi-religious collaboration, gender issues, governance, human rights, conflict, and political Islam. She has been a professor and lecturer at numerous institutions, including Queen's University in Belfast, the University of Amsterdam, and at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance in Stockholm. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert. It's a tremendous, actually, pleasure to be here, and you'll probably be able to understand why it's an added pleasure by the time I'm done with my talk. But I want to start by thanking Katherine Marshall and her team, Nava, Friedman, and Crystal, for the actual logistics of getting me here, and certainly to the United Nations Foundation and the Universal Access Project and Pristine Connections for International Health for the tremendous work that they have done in being courageous enough, I think, brave enough to support and solicit this work on faith-based engagement on family planning. I actually have so much to say that I don't know where to begin. Perhaps the first thing to say is that I think this report is absolutely phenomenal, and it serves a tremendous area of need and a niche, which is really, as you put it very well, it vindicates to a huge extent the work of faith-based or faith-inspired organizations. And I'm particularly grateful for the fact that the examples that have been listed so neatly in the report through the case studies span many, many countries. Usually we tend to hear of faith-based health engagement in sub-Saharan Africa. What this report does is it shows the variety of this kind of engagement in many countries where there is unmet need. In fact, there is a great deal more, and I fully appreciate what Katherine said. This is but the tip of the iceberg, but it's a mighty fine light on that tip of the iceberg. So I want to commend the authors of the report and the initiative very, very strongly. I intend to make this report as widely available as possible through the context of the United Nations. One of the hats I have is to serve as the coordinator of a United Nations interagency task force, which brings together over 10 UN development agencies and offices who are working on part of their work is engaging with faith-based actors. So this is the kind of work that I think would be extremely helpful for them to be instructed on and about. Which brings me to a very interesting, again, commendation of the report, because it doesn't look at family planning through the exclusive lens of family planning. It effectively showcases how it is that faith-based organizations and faith-inspired health actors generally work on a whole range of health aspects, including family planning. It's not like in the relatively more secular international development community where we parcel out people's lives into, well, this has to do with the mind, this has to do with this part of the body, this has to do with that part of the body, this has to do with... But when faith-inspired actors and faith-based organizations are actually engaging, they engage with the human being as a whole. So when they're serving health of that whole human being. And so it's also a holistic perspective, because they're looking at the human whole, as opposed to us when we like to parcel out health and then take its various components and give them to different agencies and say, okay, well, you're only working on that one. We do that with culture, too, which is another interesting point that this report addresses very nicely. We tend to see that culture is distinct from religion, and I have a bit of a problem with that, being an Arab Muslim woman myself. At no point have I really been able to draw that very clear line between what is cultural and what is religious. What is cultural is very much informed by what is ostensibly understood as religious, and it may be very, very misunderstood, but there you are. And vice versa. What is religious is very much informed by what we consider to be our cultural heritage and dynamics. So that really fine distinction that we make in the secular development world between culture and religion is frankly non-existent as far as I've been able to live it and study it for over 3 decades. And I think this is part of the beautiful dynamic of health work, is that we try to say, well, actually, this is not really religious, this is cultural. Well, that's grand. The fact of the matter is that they kind of tend to overlap. So therefore, whether we like it or not, if we're going to be serious about taking cultural dimensions or aspects into account, per definition, it really does mean, I'm really sorry to have to clarify, but it really does mean that you have to take religion into account. Not so long ago, we sat with a group of colleagues from another UN agency, which is renowned for its ownership of the culture, global culture mandate, which is a very major mandate, and basically to try to discuss why is it that religion should not be included as culture, as part of culture. Religion has to be seen as a distinct, separate culture. Is really not, doesn't have to be religion. So I couldn't believe that in this day and age, we are still having this conversation about whether or not religion should be considered part of culture. Yes, it is highly politicized, and that's another beautiful thing that this report brings out. You cannot discuss religion without looking at the political elements of what is going on. In any given country, in any given region, the religious dimensions and the religious implications, including on health, have plenty to do with the relationship between the religious actors and the politicians, and vice versa. And there is no space anywhere in the world, not even in this place where we're sitting in right now, where you can actually make that schism and say, well, actually, Caesar has nothing to do with the church. Well, I'm really sorry, but he does. And they have a lot to do with each other. And that is just the reality. And it gets more complicated in developing countries and contexts. It doesn't get less complicated or more clear, the boundaries between the two. So given that these are some of the ongoing dynamics, I think it's extremely helpful to have a report that indeed showcases where the political comes in, where the cultural comes in, and how they're very strongly intertwined with the continuum of health care provision. One of the things that I found also extremely helpful is that at some point, I remember very clearly being at the International Conference on Population Development in 1994 in Cairo. And one of the things that I personally took out of this particular series of engagements is that you cannot talk about reproductive health. You cannot talk about family planning without talking about reproductive health. You cannot talk about population without talking about women. And you cannot talk about development without talking of rights. And that set of interconnectedness, I think, is what those of us who work in the secular development world have come out very strongly with, that you have a context which is human rights, but that context has much to do with the context of development in general, and certainly with population issues, to the extent that you cannot talk about giving birth without talking about the women that are involved in that process, and that perhaps they might have some rights in that context. Having said that, I think what we're facing today is a situation where we backed away, and I think the report does address this. We backed away from family planning for a while because we were talking a great deal about sexual and reproductive health, which brought us face to face with a lot of political issues and cultural baggage. You talk about sexual and reproductive health, and you have to come face to face with some very angry religious leaders and politicians, because this is a domain that has plenty to do with what they have to do, what they believe they have to do. So it is a bit of a surprise, perhaps, that, or perhaps it isn't, it's an irony, that after 20 years after the Cairo population, we've gone back to talking specifically about family planning, and we're now making the argument again that, excuse us, would you please just note that family planning is part of sexual and reproductive health. So it's a fascinating pendulum, this of human development and human behavior. I wanted to end by looking at a few things relevant to what has been mentioned in the report and under the recommendations in particular. And I think one of the key things is that came out in the recommendations is it says something along the lines of we need to work to build areas of agreement on family planning, such as the integration of family planning into broader health programs and its importance for consensus goals, such as maternal and child health and the Millennium Development Goals. And my first reaction to that was of course, absolutely. It's integrating family planning into broader sexual and reproductive health, which in turn needs to be integrated much better into health. We're now talking about post-MDGs, post-Millennium Development Goals. One of the key things that's coming out there is that there might just be the one health goal, instead of what we have today, which is MDG 3 and 5 which helped us parcel out and look specifically at maternal mortality. So if we have only one global health goal going forward, where on earth does sexual reproductive health fit into that? And to what extent will issues like family planning be given that position? Or will we suddenly be talking about global health as family planning only? And those are important policy complications that I think it's important for us to keep in mind. I appreciate always when we say we need to develop tools and disseminate them so that people may be better informed and educated, because we need to provide that evidence. And I think that argument is absolutely true. The problem, however, is that it's not the lack of tools or knowledge. It's not the lack of evidence, to be perfectly honest. In many instances, and I sit in the middle of that debacle, in many instances the problem is that people don't want to see the evidence of faith-based engagement and the engagement with faith actors. That it's really uncomfortable for a lot of policymakers to be faced with this, because it will then mean that you may have to open your decision-making tables, which is one of the reports, one of the recommendations. You will have to allow faith-based actors on those decision-making tables. And I think it's a very hard ask to make of a community of international development practitioners which has spent the last 60 years making a case for why religion should have really nothing much to do with human rights. But thank you, we've already got sacredness in human rights. I've actually heard that articulated a number of times in various UN circles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is sacred enough. Thank you. We don't need anything else next to it. And therefore, now we're saying, but we need to have the other sacred at the table, making decisions on issues relevant to who we are and how we reproduce and who we will become. It's a hard ask to make, and some people don't want to hear it. They don't want to see it. And I think that behavior change work has to happen within, internally. Very much within organizations and institutions which claim to uphold human rights. And right now we're going into full speed ahead into the human rights as the only framework that human beings need. And if it's the only framework that human beings need, and we're so keen on distinguishing it from religious domains and religious rights and the other sacred, then we have a bit of a problem going forward. And how do we try to change that? Many of our colleagues invest millions in behavior change communication, in community health workers, and they refuse to see that a key element and key actors includes the faith communities and faith in and of itself. Given that there is almost a willful ignorance of this particular area, are the tools enough? I don't think they are enough, but I'm sure glad to have this one with me.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Ray Martin, who since 2000 has served as the Executive Director of Christian Connections for International Health, which is a large network of organizations and individuals working in global health. His 48 years as an international development and public health specialist include 25 years with USAID as Chief of the Health, Population, and Nutrition Offices in Zaire, Pakistan, and Cameroon, plus tours in Ghana and Morocco, followed by several years as a public health specialist on Africa programs at the World Bank. He began as a Mennonite volunteer in community development in Somalia and in refugee development in Tanzania. So, welcome.
Thank you, Gary. I'm glad to follow my old friend Azza Karam on this. I'm going to hire you to make the case that I'm constantly making. It's great to have somebody from a secular UN organization argue for the importance of faith-based organizations. Many of you know CCIH, some of you don't. We are a pretty large network. Our brochure is out there on the table. You can pick it up on the way out. We have an insert with a list of our organizational members, which are about 160. We also have quite a few secular affiliates, plus many individual members. And our overall mission we articulate as promoting global health and wholeness from a Christian perspective. We are a Christian organization, but very ecumenical, very diverse membership. And we're also very comfortable working in interfaith settings, as well as collaborating with secular organizations, because our mission, as I say, is promoting global health and wholeness. On the issue of family planning, I used to be a USAID population officer, so I've worked in this field for decades. And in my, quote, retirement job working with this network of Christian organizations, I'd ask, well, I believe very deeply that family planning is a very empowering intervention for women and couples. I don't stop at women. I'm a man. I want to be part of the, the picture also. And it has enormous consequences for both maternal and child health that have been very well documented, as well as for family well-being, community well-being. And so how, as faith-based organizations, could we ignore family planning as a very important and integral component of global health? Yet, with all the controversies about family planning, in some quarters, even the term family planning or contraceptive is sort of toxic. There are the differences among different religious organizations about what's okay or what isn't okay. Karen alluded to them. And so maybe the safest course for a big network of Christian organizations like CCIH would be to limit our work in safer areas like, immunization or even AIDS, gets into some controversial areas too. But we are scientists, we are public health professionals, we are driven by the evidence as well as being inspired by faith. So we felt that we really needed to see whether there would be a way that we can engage in this controversial subject and still remain true to our faith values and respect the concerns of our various members. And so some years ago, we conducted a survey. We just surveyed our members and asked them whether they provide family planning services, whether they do family planning education, whether they're against it or whether they're okay with it, what are their issues, what terminology do they prefer, and the results of that, which are in this book, which we have on our website that we can refer you to if you're interested, gave us the courage, and thank you for using the word courage, Azza, gave us the courage to get actively involved in the topic of family planning. And so our efforts have been helped very much by the grants we've been receiving several years from the UN Foundation under the Universal Access Project. And so we've become, over the years, a very out front voice seeking to make the case that faith-based organizations, for the most part, are pro-family planning, and that there is a lot of latent potential in the faith community, the kind of resources, the assets that Karen and her organization can tap into for us, for faith-based organizations to play a much bigger role in various global health programs than they've typically been given the opportunity to play. So in addition to family planning, we're very involved. We just got a grant from the Gavi Alliance to advocate for immunizations. We're trying to get a grant to get involved in issues like tobacco and so forth, all for the reasons that faith-based organizations, we're convinced, can play a major role in helping these global campaigns reach their very ambitious targets. And I would suggest that the potential of the faith-based community can be sort of categorized in two very broad areas. One is the very significant proportion of health services that are provided by faith-based organizations that Katherine and others mentioned. And the other is the influence that religious leaders have on people in their countries. So if there are questions about whether family planning is a good thing to practice, or whether contraception is an okay thing in a village in Africa somewhere, if the faith leader, if the imam or the priest or the pastor understand what this is all about and say, yeah, this is a good thing, that can have a very important impact in demand creation. So faith-based organizations can play a significant role both in supply and in demand creation. And that is why we in CCIH are so involved in the area of family planning and in some of these other areas, hopefully some new areas, in trying to more completely and efficiently mobilize the assets of the faith community to play a significant role along with other stakeholders in helping to make this world a better place. So the one expression of that was what we call the Nairobi Declaration. CCIH, along with a couple other actors, organized a global consultation a couple years ago, culminating in a conference in Nairobi involving Christians of all different types, Muslims, Hindu, and Buddhist. And we had a struggle, but in the end we came up with this Nairobi Declaration that expressed, on an interfaith basis, support for family planning as an important component of overall family and community well-being. And the declaration is on the internet too. We can refer you to that if you want to read that declaration. So I am very, very pleased by this report. Of course, I'm pleased that we were part of the dialogue that led to this report. Katherine and her team at the World Faith Development Dialogue did a fantastic job, in my opinion. Others have expressed that too. And so it's very, very delightful for us to be a part of launching officially this report. Mona Bormet, our advocacy person, Kathy Erb, our communications person, who are here, are going to be using this a lot in helping us get out the message. We have other tools. We actually were involved in producing a little booklet, Love, Children, and Family Planning, with Bible-based discussion guides on how family planning can fit into people's lives and make a positive contribution. So this report is one more tool that will help all of us, hopefully, to more fully engage faith-based organizations along with other stakeholders in trying to reach the very ambitious goals of Family Planning 2020 to reduce unmet need by 1/2 between now and the year 2020. And we're grateful for the UN Foundation Universal Access Project for supporting this project, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. We're now going to, in a second, go to you all to have questions from the floor. As you think those up in your head, I want to give you a chance to frame your questions. So I thought I'd ask Katherine to highlight one or maybe two compelling stories from the report.
There are countless stories of desperate women or of joyful women. But I'm going to take another example. I was in Indonesia last summer, visiting an organization called the Famina Institute, which works on reinterpreting Islam, but also their community organizers, community activists working in many areas. And one of the things that was unexpected to me was their involvement with issues of family planning. And they, first of all, work in the Muslim schools, the Pasantren, in trying to give some information to girls. And just to give you an idea how basic it is, a lot of the girls have no real understanding of menstruation. They don't understand what it is, and so forth. They also don't have very much access. But there are a couple of messages that I thought were worth bringing out here. And just to a sort of spoiler alert, the basic issue is complexity that we're dealing, and the fact that the issues that we're talking about with family planning are not very far from the issues of global security. In this case, Indonesia was well known. There are books written about it as an example of the remarkable family planning programs and the active engagement of the vast Muslim organizations, NU and Muhammadiyah, which were actively involved, which were positive forces in a transformation of Indonesia, which has the world's largest Muslim population. What I heard in Indonesia this summer is that there is a backlash and a backsliding. And this backsliding is related first to decentralization. So local authorities are now responsible for health, including family planning, and the leadership, which came from the central government, has fizzled, so that you're not seeing that. Plus, the local authorities tend to be afraid of what they call radical Islam, which, for various reasons, has taken an opposing view to family planning, has basically argued that women's duty is to have as many children as possible, and above all, that their husband should have the major role. But one of the key things that came out there was that during this period of extraordinary success in family planning and cooperation, what had never happened was a conversation about people's attitudes and views. The religious leaders, the ulama, had never been involved, had never been asked what their views were. And what that meant was that when the national leadership was less significant, was less clear, the priority was less clear, and their responsibility because of the decentralization was there had been no conversation, and therefore the opposition suddenly came out of the woodwork. And further, the advocates of family planning, the feminists, found themselves without the language, without the knowledge that they needed to be able to communicate with the religious leaders, moderate and not moderate. And so an organization like the one I was visiting, Famina, all of a sudden has a huge role in trying to have a conversation not about theology or about the verses of the Quran, but what Islam means for lived religion, for people's lives, and for the roles of women and the roles of men. So I think that's a lesson in the fact that we can never be complacent, even though we've seen extraordinary progress on family planning. We can never be complacent, and that having these conversations which require us to deal with different views is an absolutely critical part of the story, that we cannot just brush aside the objections. So that was certainly a lesson I took from it. A second, since I don't see people at the mics yet, a second lesson which I wrote about in the Huffington Post was a chance visit to a clinic in Kibera, which is considered the largest slum in the world, and seeing this Baptist-run clinic and their matter-of-fact attitude towards family planning. This is no big deal. What is the problem? If women, their sense that women are desperate, that women need to be able not to have a baby every year, to have a baby every 3 years, every 2 years. And they need those services. And just to have a clinic that was open to what they needed, not to their theology, was an interesting lesson.
It's so interesting to me that the dissonance between sort of position statements and actual lived faith. In the church, we say, if you want to know what people really believe, don't look at the position statements, read the hymnal, because there's like the lived reality, and then there's the institutional reality, which often can be at great distance from each other. I believe we've got people wanting to speak. Would you like to ask a question? Or
Is this on? Yes. Yeah. My name is Hazel Denton. I'm currently an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown teaching a course on demography and development. And this report is extremely helpful for bringing forward the combination of development and faith, which is very difficult to bring into the classroom. So thank you very much for this report. I have one comment and one question. The comment is, it's so sad to see under the recommendations that we have to seek a, quote, safe arena to have a discussion of these issues separate from US policy. When you look at the history, the leadership role that the US has played in women's reproductive health, I found that quite depressing, but very glad to see it in print. My question is, we have a new pope. He's very aware of poverty. One of the critical aspects of poverty is the inability to control one's reproductive health. Is there any slight chance there might be an opening for a discussion on this with the Catholic Church? Do you see any optimistic options?
who'd like to field that question?
I can speak to hopes, but not to predictions.
Okay.
You want me to?
Sure.
Oh.
Better a hope than nothing.
That wasn't an offer to elaborate.
Oh, okay.
What I hope happens, but I'm not a Catholic, but what I hope happens is that in time, the choice of the next generation of bishops and cardinals is going to be looking at a different set of qualifications or criteria than maybe has happened under past popes, and that over the coming years and a decade or two, there may be a new set of leadership which prioritizes different things than those that were prioritized in the past. And so there will be sort of a slow evolution toward more openness on issues like contraception that may happen without any bombshell new revelation from heaven of a different policy.
Yeah, I'm just working through Evangelii Gaudium right now myself, the Joy of the Gospel, his apostolic exhortation. And it's an extremely encouraging document on many fronts, and I think we're more likely to see kind of pragmatic developments rather than doctrinal developments. Mm-hmm. So I think that's helpful. Azza, did you want to say?
I believe you actually captured it yourself in what you've just said. Just that there's, I'm sure many of you are aware, but there has been a survey that went around all the Catholic dioceses, effectively from the Vatican, asking questions that include questions about contraception and marital relations and so on. And I think the results should be released any minute now. But the point is that I think there's definitely an idea that we need to reassess how the teachings are being taken on board or not, and where this gap exists between what is being advocated at the leadership level and what's actually happening on the ground, and what ordinary average people, Catholics, have to say about this. And I think that in and of itself is a very important endeavor. It may not change teachings, but it will change attitudes of the church vis-a-vis its own congregants. So I think that's an important.
Thank you. Okay, over this side.
Hi, congratulations on your new report. I'm Todd Post from Breadful World Institute. I'm taken by that story Karen told about the woman who had to walk outside her home every night and take her birth control pill. A big piece of, I think, what I haven't heard discussed here and oftentimes left out of this conversation is the role of men in the and how we act. Providing the services to women who have to do it have to take advantage of it in a clandestine way. It doesn't seem like the ideal way of solving this problem or dealing with this issue. So can you talk about how the role of faith communities, the church, beyond just talking to the Pope or talking to the imams or talking to the pastors, but actually dealing with the men in these communities so that they're brought along too.
Karen, do you want to take a whack at that, or do you want to?
That's right. I think that not just in family planning, it's not just in family planning. And I think in all our development work, including, we learned a lot of lessons in HIV and AIDS, particularly in HIV prevention, where for the longest time, maybe for 2 decades or 15 years, we left our men behind. We concentrated on talking to women, and we forgot that the men had so much power at home. And I'm relating this to the use of condoms in the home in terms of HIV prevention. I would have colleagues very well educated, and if they suspected that the man was having an extramarital affair, and these were the conversations we would have then in the early 90s. And we discovered that even with the education, the woman was still not assertive enough to go and insist that the man who she may be suspecting is having an extramarital affair, she would insist on a condom use in the home. This is just one example. And the men even today have so much power. With regards to contraceptives, the women I have interacted with, they would like to space their children, or they would like to have fewer children so they can go back and develop their careers. And what some of them have said is that my husband wants more children. And the husbands, in turn, are having the pressure from their moms and from their sisters and from, who want more of their nieces and grandchildren. I think for us, what is working right now is that we are working with some communities, the Churches Health Association of Zambia, using PMTCT as an entry point and insisting that the man should come to the clinic for prenatal care, to the clinic with the wife. And that we're finding that when you do that, men sometimes, at home, they feel they don't have they don't have the courage and they want to participate. It's like traditionally it's always been a woman's issue, prenatal care, family planning. And what we as development workers, I think the mistake we've made over the decades is just we have left men behind. But definitely there are entry points. Entry points through the congregations. The congregant, there are women. I know the Protestant churches, they have women clubs within the churches. And sometimes we've used that as an entry point to discuss family planning and other health issues.
Catherine, did you want to?
Just very briefly, there are a number of the case studies which reflect the growing awareness, I think you would say, that men have to be part of programs and of the conversation. But the phenomenon does take us to the broader issue of what does women's empowerment and equality mean, and it relates to the issues of domestic violence and relationships within the household. So once again, an issue that is very central to people's lives takes us into the very complex issue of this transformation in the modern world of relationships between men and women, which I think is why in almost every single discussion of faith and development, it is these gender issues that come out. I mean, to me, it is a constant source of amazement how many religious issues come back to sexuality and relationships between men and women. So family planning is clearly a very central issue to that, but we need to keep having this conversation of why is women's empowerment, why are women's rights not a threat to everything we've treasured, but it is one of the blessings of modern life.
And there's a link between the economic empowerment of women and their ability then to have more agency in all of these areas, I would think, too, right? Yes?
This is for tall people. Nancy Harris from JSI. I will join the chorus or the choir saying what a wonderful and very, very useful report this is on many levels. But I had 2 words and one little disappointment with the recommendations. One word is funding and the other word is contraceptives. As a practical person who likes to think about how it plays out in programs, we've heard that every time we bring the subject up, someone says we don't have enough contraceptives. Contraceptives are the least expensive thing we can do to promote family planning. And UNFPA and AID are providing contraceptives. Gates is not funding for some inexplicable reason. There is a huge lack of contraceptives. And the other is funding. Now, I know when you get down to the ground, there is not enough funding for the faith groups to move forward with the things they want to do for their integrated programs. So I would have liked, and I still would like, a strong voice saying, okay, FP 2020 dialogue and the goals are wonderful. Let's see us put some real money in real programs in real countries on the ground with faith groups, and you will be amazed what they can do.
Yes.
Yes, Azza.
The reason I immediately put my hand up is because I'm so grateful for you for asking that question. It was one of the anecdotes that I wanted to share with you all, and I wasn't sure whether I should or not, so I'm going to do it anyway. UNFPA, a lot of its work is, of course, a good amount of its work, not all of it, is this dissemination and distribution of commodities, including contraception. And actually, there have been, especially after this London meeting on family planning, a significant amount of resources which were given to UNFPA to further support this work on the dissemination of commodities, particularly contraceptives. It's fascinating to me how it's been now 4 years since UNFPA has been officially approached by a number of faith-based organizations, especially many of those who work all over sub-Saharan Africa, who have made a specific request to please be on the receiving end of some of these contraceptives so that they could themselves undertake, as you were saying, to disseminate, given that they have the most remarkable outreach capacities of dissemination. It's been 4 years since that request was made. The request was made 3 times by the same umbrella groups of faith-based health associations. And every single time, the response from my colleagues in UNFPA has been, these are really complicated processes of dissemination. We have huge agreements that need to be negotiated and signed with the national governments. It is very difficult indeed to tell the national government whom they should be working with or they should distribute what we give them to distribute. So we find it awkward as a UN agency to be saying you should really, to say to the government, you should work with these groups if they're not already working with these groups, and therefore not knowing that these groups would be interested in disseminating. But all to say that I think, quite frankly, that could have easily been, if that was the main issue, that could have been resolved without too much complication. But the intentionality to resolve it, to actually listen to what the faith-based groups have asked for, especially that it involves disseminating condoms, when we are so much more comfortable sitting and thinking to ourselves, they never do that. They're always the block about that. They're always the ones who call against it, they being all the faith-based groups. That is what needs to change within some of these institutions and organizations. So my point isn't even about the resources and the availability. We have a mental block when it comes to some of these things, because the demand is there, the supply is there. And those who are ostensibly in the middle are the ones who have a certain perception and attitude that refuses to facilitate the process.
That's interesting. Katherine?
I have very much the same point, but one of my senses of where we need to go next is we need to have this conversation with governments, because every country has a different system, and it's all very well for us to sit in Washington the real decisions as to how funds are distributed, and the other side of it, which is critical, who's at the table, are made really country by country. And that, I think, is to me the next frontier. But unless we have an adult conversation about these issues in these kinds of settings, it's very difficult to take that to the much more politicized, diverse, complicated settings at country level.
We have one more question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marla Spivak. I'm at the Center for Global Development. And my question's actually also specifically for Ms. Sichinga. I was really interested to hear, and this is building, I think, on the conversation we were just having about your work engaging directly with the government. And you spoke a little bit about some of the challenges you have with that, specifically related to access and commodities and supply chains. But I was just curious to hear you talk a little more about what the challenges that your organization has faced in working directly with the Zambian government, and maybe some of the successes, things that you found that actually you're collaborating very well and it's working.
Thank you. I think for us, what is working very well, just when Zambia got independence in 1964, when we had more church hospitals than the government of the day, and the government policy, the new government policy was that health and education would be free to all Zambians, because at that time we had very few educated people, and we were only 3 million then. And the policy, the national policy on health was that it would be free. And so as chairs then, at that time, we took advantage of that national health policy. And so we entered into a memorandum of understanding with government, which is still in force today, although we do update it time and time again. There are 3 issues in the memorandum of understanding with Churches Health Association of Zambia and the government. The 3 issues in the memorandum of understanding are that all health workers, doctors, nurses, and all allied workers would be civil servants and seconded to mission health facilities. So whether Catholic or Protestant mission health facilities, all these allies, all workers in the facilities are government, they're civil servants. The second key point in the memorandum of understanding, which government observes, is that essential medicines would come from government through medical stores. And the third issue is that the running cost for church hospitals, at least 75% would come from government. So for CHARS, that is working very well, and we have had our colleagues and sister organizations come to learn about our memorandum of understanding. And the issue, when we're going through these negotiations, where if you are saying that you as government is responsible for the health care of the Zambian people, then it doesn't matter whether Karen decides to go to a mission health facility or a government facility. So in fact, what you see at home is in one district you have two hospitals, and sometimes in those districts, a mission hospital is the one that is designated to be the district hospital. And so government ensures that we have staff there, we have at least 75% running cost. We also have the essential medicines. So where we as Secretariat for the Mission Hospital fill in the gap, of course there's a lot of gaps. The ART programs, the malaria control program, those commodities. So for the developmental partners that we work with, and when we articulate the gaps that are there, then we are funding. For example, we are a principal recipient of the Global Fund since 11 years ago, and we're still a principal recipient today. But I think that those 3 issues in the Memorandum of Understanding is what has worked. Now, the downside to that is that, if the health workers that are seconded to church hospitals, they can't be transferred anytime. You know that in our region we have suffered a shortage in terms of human resource for health. So then, when there are shortages in government hospitals, it means that sometimes somebody from the mission hospital may be asked to go and go to a government facility. But by and large, we have a dialogue all the time, and that's the system that has worked very well. The downside to that, in terms of family planning, we have no funding. We had funding with the Canadian government some years back, which worked very well in terms of family planning, but since 5 years ago, that funding is no longer there because Zambia was no longer a target country for the Canadian government for family planning. So it left a gap. So it means that when the commodities are in short supply at medical stores, even now our facilities cannot access them. Yeah. But that system works very well. And the memorandum of understanding then ensures that CHAR's facilities, mission health facilities, because we don't pay salaries for the workers, the running cost is coming from the government. It may be inadequate, but sometimes it's inadequate because even in government facilities, it is inadequate. The essential drugs may be inadequate even in government. So it means what that system ensures and guarantees for CHAR's facilities is that they are sustainable. So any development partners who's going to help CHARs with any program, even family planning, indirectly is actually supporting government. And government is okay with that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry to call time, but I need to and turn it back to Seema.
Well, thank you so much to Reverend Hall, to Katherine, to Karen, to Azza, and to Ray for such an enlightening and honest and open discussion. I hope our discussion today has shed new light on the intersections between faith-inspired organizations, and working to meet the unmet need globally for women and girls. And as was pointed out today, there really is an unmet need. There are still 220 million women around the world who want but who do not have access to quality and modern methods of family planning and reproductive health. It's unfortunate that sometimes faith and family planning are seen as opposite sides of the same spectrum. But as we've seen today, advocates of family planning, reproductive health, and faith are all working really for the same cause, which is to improve the lives of women and girls, men, and their families and communities around the world. We learned today from our excellent panel that this report is only the tip of the iceberg, and there are many more stories to be told. Faith groups, in some cases, have been doing this work even before government services, and they have decades and decades of experience. That faith actors can also bring a truly holistic approach to improving the lives of women, girls, and families, and that there still continues to be much more potential in working with faith communities in delivering these services. I hope that today will change the conversation and spark new conversations so that all of our communities can work even more closely together for these important issues. Again, there's more copies of the report outside. Please do take extra copies for colleagues who were not able to join today. And finally, I think some of our panelists will be staying around for a few more minutes if there's still unanswered questions in the room. Thank you for your time again today, for your insights, and for your contribution to this. Thank you all for coming.